For many years, Final Fantasy has found itself on the periphery, burdened by the very ideals that once pushed the franchise to the forefront of gaming. In the build-up to the release of Final Fantasy XV, it led to the game's director, Hajime Tabata, speaking of how the franchise had become infected with a disease. He believed that this disease had stemmed from entitlement and fear. If a new Final Fantasy game did not 100% adhere to the wider consensus of what a Final Fantasy game should be, then it would already be written off as a bad game and a failure. Final Fantasy XVI has been faced with those same criticisms from the day it was announced. It has been battered, bloodied, and bruised. But with each new piece of media came hope. Hope that perhaps Final Fantasy XVI could be the game we've all been waiting for, even if we didn't know we were. The game that could truly embody the spirit of Final Fantasy. That hope has been further fueled by a development team full of absolute conviction. Their vision for Final Fantasy XVI is crystal clear, and they are unapologetic. New approaches have been taken, and they are pushing Final Fantasy in a direction that's for some unknown territory. Undoubtedly, this entails a certain level of risk, but considering a significant portion of the Final Fantasy XVI senior leadership team also spearheaded the revival of Final Fantasy XIV, methodically reconstructing the entire game from its very foundation and transforming it into an exemplar of triumph within the video games industry. Their unwavering commitment to pursuing grand endeavours or accepting nothing less than extraordinary outcomes should hardly come as a surprise. That then brings us to this extensive review. Throughout, we will meticulously describe Final Fantasy XVI's foundational elements in our typical granular style. Emphasis will be placed on gameplay, story and wider narrative intricacies, structure, presentation, and of course, lasting appeal. Due to the sheer volume of content featured, timestamps have been provided to help you navigate between the various sections at your leisure. It should also be noted that despite its considerable length, this review will be as spoiler-free as possible. We will primarily be using footage from trailers and the demo, but there may be a few exceptions here and there. In our most recent preview, it was said that we have an uncanny ability to strike an amazing balance between being incredibly detailed without spoiling anything, and we hope to continue that sentiment throughout this review. Before we begin, it does also need to be said that Square Enix provided a free copy of Final Fantasy XVI solely for the purposes of conducting this review, but this has in no way affected our judgment, nor has it directly influenced any assertions we are about to present. And with that, thus did our journey begin. During the early stages of development, it was decided that Final Fantasy XVI should embrace action. In truth, the franchise had been flirting with this change for some time. Hiroyuki Ito, the creator of the now famed active time battle system and director of Final Fantasy VI and IX, would serve as the pioneer. He felt as though the ATB system had run its course, and when working on Final Fantasy XII, Ito made use of the additional horsepower to create the active dimension battle system. The system was fast-paced and had a real-time element. That element meant controlling the entire party at the same time was often too difficult, and so the developers created gambits to help manage everything. These used the same underlying principles to determine actions taken by monsters during the Super Nintendo era, and they were offered to the player as a way of helping to determine how the party would act given certain scenarios. Final Fantasy XIII, XV, and the Final Fantasy VII Remake would further these action-based aspirations, introducing different variations of fast-paced real-time combat. But none of them truly embraced action. There were still clear ties back to the turn-based systems of old, even if they weren't always front and center. Final Fantasy XVI has not taken that approach. It's action through and through. Now, it's easy to understand why this may be daunting. As mentioned, even the more recent action-based entries in the franchise had turn-based systems designed to cater for those still yearning for the days of true turn-based Final Fantasy games. Even though no such systems exist within Final Fantasy XVI, the developers have included elements to help ease the transition. The rings of accessibility, for example, will allow players to cater the experience to their desired difficulty, but the game also features very generous checkpointing. Should the player fall while in the field, the game will respawn them to a nearby location, and should this happen during a boss encounter, the game will reset at the start of the most recent phase. In both instances, health will be replenished, and potions and high potions will be restocked to the maximum available capacity. Much time has also been spent on balancing. At the start of the game, Clive's toolkit is quite limited. He can perform basic melee and magic attacks, and can utilise some abilities associated with the Phoenix. This helps to place emphasis on learning the foundational aspects of combat, and as ability points are obtained, and you, as the player, become more comfortable with navigating the combat setting, it's possible to learn and drip feed in abilities that are innate to Clive, such as Lunge, Burning Blade, and Downward Thrust. Each of these innate abilities can then be upgraded to further their utility, and through this system, it's possible to create some fantastic combinations that look stunning and deal considerable damage. But the real spectacle comes from the special abilities associated with the icons. By default, Clive has access to the Phoenix Shift. This allows him to quickly close the distance, performing either a melee strike or magic burst, irrespective of whether the enemy is on the ground or in the air. This default ability, which cannot be changed, is then complemented by 4 others, of which only 2 can be selected by the player. In the case of the Phoenix, each of the abilities has a specific gameplay application, and it means that even in the game's early stages, it's possible to start tailoring towards a specific playstyle. Rising Flames, for example, is a great burst damage attack. It focuses on a single target and can even launch them into the air. Heatwave, on the other hand, is very potent for those that like counterpunching. It can negate an enemy projectile, allowing Clive to counter with a slew of his own. At specific progression milestones, Clive will then be granted access to new iconic abilities. In the initial sense, when these new powers are obtained, there's a natural sense of progression. You will go from being able to wield the power of 1 icon to 2 icons simultaneously, and then 3. And by being able to cycle through these ability sets, it's possible to create powerful combinations. What's impressive is that each icon feels wholly unique. Phoenix, for example, places emphasis on being quick and nimble, whereas Titan is about being strong and standing your ground. Further to this, even though newer iconic powers may seem big and shiny at first, they aren't overbearing, nor do they necessarily render some of the earlier iconic powers obsolete. It's very much down to the player to experiment and find icons and abilities that fit with their playstyle and allow them to maximize their damage output in a way that feels natural. Due to the sheer volume of abilities on offer, however, it can lead to a bit of choice paralysis, and the onus is very much on the player to go out of their way to experiment with new abilities when they're required. To offset this, a few different mechanics have been implemented. For one, the game does try its best not to overwhelm the player. There's generous pacing between the acquisition of any new powers, and this affords the player time to learn should they wish to do so. Next, there's the customization. As a fun throwback to how job abilities worked in Final Fantasy V, in Final Fantasy XVI, once abilities are upgraded and then mastered, they can be assigned to different icons. This means that should you wish to use Phoenix Shift, you're not beholden to only having Phoenix-based abilities available via the shortcut menu. You could instead, for example, assign Wicked Wheel as long as it's mastered. And then there's the Hall of Virtue. This feature is accessible from the Areta Stone, and it allows players to practice using each move and ability within a controlled environment. Furthermore, it's possible to tailor this environment in numerous ways to make it more or less comfortable, meaning you can stress test different setups and potential combinations. That such levels of customization and accommodation are afforded to the player is pretty astounding. But what's even more astounding is how flexible the combat is. There are just so many potential playstyles, due to each icon being so fundamentally different, and the abilities themselves having so many different applications. There's no right or wrong setup, only the one that allows you to achieve victory. Torgal perhaps typifies this. Alongside controlling Clive, players can also use basic commands to influence the actions taken by Torgal, his faithful companion. But it's very much the cherry on the top. When in the heat of battle, it can be far too easy to forget Torgal is even there. That's not to say Torgal is ineffective, as the Ring of Timely Assistance can compensate for players who aren't able to focus on this aspect of gameplay. Instead, it's more to highlight that Torgal has so many applications for advanced players who want to squeeze everything out of the system. He can restore small amounts of health without using potions, but can also start or extend combinations. This then leads onto the stagger system, a system that seems simple on the surface but also feels very complex. Throughout Final Fantasy XVI, you will encounter numerous bosses and large enemies. Each of these will have a will gauge, and this determines how much damage they take based on their will to continue fighting. When the gauge is halved, the enemy will become stunned, and the damage they receive will be slightly boosted. When it's depleted, they become staggered, losing the will to fight back and letting down their defenses. The more hits that are landed while an enemy is in this state, the higher the damage multiplier that's received and the greater potential for damage. Each ability Clive wields therefore has an intimate relationship with this system. There are some, such as Gouge or Wicked Wheel, that have more emphasis on reducing will by dealing lots of weaker hits in quick succession, but they can also be used to increase the damage multiplier. Others have more emphasis on dealing damage, and it may therefore make sense to save these up when the multiplier is at its highest in order to maximize output, but as they have cooldown timers, you need to plan ahead to make sure that they're available when you need them most. Figuring out the most effective ways to A. reduce will quickly, and then B. maximize output once an enemy is staggered will become a core part of the combat experience. There's also a clear difference between the stagger system featured in Final Fantasy XVI compared to previous iterations, and this difference makes it feel much more balanced. You will, of course, deal more damage during times when enemies are staggered, and there's the added bonus of not having to worry about defending. But it's not a requirement for success. If you wanted to focus on pure damage dealing as opposed to trying to break will, then that's a perfectly viable approach, and you won't feel like you need to break will in order to achieve victory. These types of encounters also highlight how well the game manages the spectacle. All of these elements come together during boss fights, and there are so many. This could have been a recipe for disaster, as repetition could have crept in, but in all honesty, there is very little. Each boss encounter stands on its own 2 feet, offering a unique challenge to the player. And what's intriguing is that some bosses are even downgraded as the game progresses, appearing as standard enemies in the field. They still retain the same movesets, but their importance is diminished as they are replaced by tougher and more challenging boss encounters. There are, of course, also showpiece boss encounters, and these do not disappoint. Everything comes together, from narrative context that provides drive, music that enriches and enhances that drive, and mechanics that keep the player engaged throughout. In short, Final Fantasy XVI features some of the best boss encounters ever. One of the crucial components is that these encounters have so many layers, and perhaps the most important layer is the iconic encounters. As the game progresses and more powers awaken, the iconic encounters become ever more complex and spectacular. The initial sparring session against Garuda is but a mere taste of what's to come, and the influence of Final Fantasy XIV shines through in these instances. Projectiles and melee strikes will need to be evaded, but there are also much bigger enemy attacks that have huge areas of effect, and to help players prepare, patterns will appear on the floor. These encounters also have numerous phases, with each one upping the ante. And encounters can even take on new forms, changing the setting to suit the narrative context as the fight progresses and becomes grander in scope. Now, much has been said in jest about QTEs, but they become the cornerstone of these encounters. In the heat of the moment, mashing the square button in frenetic fashion taps into some carnal instincts that are brought to the surface, and they help to make sure these encounters will live long in the memory. Now, it was mentioned that the narrative context helps to drive these fights forward, and it shouldn't be understated how important this particular aspect is. But in the wider sense, the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI hits all the right beats. There's a captivating protagonist, a compelling supporting cast, and a formidable group of antagonists. When combined with the living, breathing world of Valisthea, which in itself contains entire nations and small dwellings that are packed full of their own subsets of characters, it means there's considerable substance. Focus, though, is placed around Clive Rossfield. As a teenager, Clive was assigned as the first Shield of Rosaria and guardian to his brother, the Dominant of Phoenix. But after everything came crashing down following what happened at Phoenix Gate, Clive ended up living a life of persecution. The only thing that kept him going was the thought that one day he may avenge the devastation that was brought upon him. Throughout this quest, Clive will interact with numerous characters, good and bad, and the biggest compliment that can be paid is that these characters all end up feeling genuine. Their motivations for either assisting or opposing Clive are crystal clear, and one of the tools used by the developers to ensure this plays out as intended is time. Characters are woven into the narrative in quite masterful ways, and by using time, the player is able to better understand how and why relationships developed in the ways that they did. Perhaps one of the best examples of this is the multifaceted relationship that exists and subsequently develops between Clive and Jill Warwick. It's revealed within the prologue that Jill Warwick is not a Rosarian native. She is from the Northern Territories and became a ward of Rosaria as part of negotiations between the two states. Elwyn Rossfield, the Archduke of Rosaria and father of Clive and Joshua, chose to raise Jill as one of his own children, and as a consequence, she developed a close bond with the two brothers. But she too was affected by what happened at Phoenix Gate, and when she becomes reunited with Clive, their relationship has been damaged and is in need of mending. You get to witness how this relationship is rebuilt and then developed further. And although it's all from the perspective of Clive, as, after all, he is the main protagonist of Final Fantasy XVI, there are moments when he's placed more on the periphery so that others may have their chance to shine. And in the case of Jill, it means that time within the narrative is afforded so that she may face her own demons, all the while knowing that Clive would be there to support her, come what may. To further emphasise how much effort has been placed around this particular aspect of world building, you'll also become well aware that Jill has developed her own relationships with other characters, some from the life she led after Phoenix Gate, and others from the life she comes to lead after being reunited with Clive. And this is another strength of the narrative. The relationships we see are interpersonal. Not everything revolves around Clive. Every character has their own allegiances, and this then plays into the wider realm of Valisthea and the extensive lore that has been created. This lore is then expounded upon by the ideologies that fuel the various nations. As you interact with people, they will act and behave in ways that are befitting of their station, manifesting those ideologies in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable. But as the story develops, you will see things change. People and nations adapt as the landscape of Valisthea is modified, and there are 3 ways in which this is evidenced. Perhaps the most interesting innovation in this area is something called active time lore. During any cutscene, it's possible to pause and view key pieces of information that are contextual to what's happening. These can then be viewed later as a collection within the 1,000 Tomes, which is accessible by speaking to Hippocrates. In the past, Square Enix has tried similar systems, but what's different here is that very little of the information found within the 1,000 Tomes should come as a surprise to the player. It's more so there to chronicle what you already know and provide a point of reference in the moment. For this reason, entries will update over time when more information is gleaned about a specific person or place. Hippocrates will then add a few flourishes after upgrading your lore level, but none of this is required reading to understand the story. To complement the 1,000 Tomes, Vivian Ninetales offers information on the state of the realm. Whereas Hippocrates is focused on the past, Vivian is focused on the present. And when speaking to her, you will gain an important understanding about what's happening in the wider realm of Valisthea outside of your sphere of view. But the most influential element for gaining true immersion into the world of Valisthea is the side quests. Side quests often have a negative connotation, as in the most basic sense they are there to inflate playtime. But when done correctly, they can enrich a world. And that's very much the case with Final Fantasy XVI, as almost every side quest is purposeful and has a clear narrative meaning. One of the first, for example, has Clive delivering food to those who are less fortunate. On the surface, it's not the most glamorous of tasks. You aren't going out and slaying some huge foe that's been terrorizing a village. But that's the point. When this side quest takes place, Clive is new to the community, and he needs to earn their trust and learn more about his new surroundings. Side quests are also a way of building out the extended supporting cast. Outside of Clive's hub, which contains his closest allies, there are sympathizers who exist throughout Valisthea. Each has built their own communities, and side quests enable you to learn more about them. This relates to how they're trying to make the world a better place for those who live under their care, but also the individuals that exist within the communities they've established. One classic example has you finding a carpenter who's needed to help fix a bridge. It seems a bit inconsequential at the time, but you'll encounter this NPC much later in the game, and by learning more about his past, you'll learn more about how one of the nearby villages was overrun by the Blight. As the game progresses, more and more side quests will appear, and they will grow in scope and narrative importance. Many serve as the perfect complement to the main story, providing further context to the player about what they're doing and how it affects Valisthea as a whole. And with them being sensitive to whatever has happened within the main story up to that point, they never take you out of the moment. Instead, side quests do the opposite, keeping you engaged and focused on the wider objective. Towards the end of the journey, these notions are further amplified. Some of the late game side quests are so good that they wouldn't have felt out of place being part of the main scenario. It's likely that some tears will even be shed. And this is only possible due to how invested the game encourages you to become in the lives of the various NPCs you've met, but also the world of Valisthea as a whole. That Clive is the sole playable protagonist is not to the detriment of the wider cast. Their individual story arcs have incredible value, and whether they're friend or foe, you will become invested in either supporting them on their journeys or plotting their downfall. Perhaps the only criticism is that certain characters get a bit more time in the spotlight than others, as well as more satisfactory resolutions to their story arcs. But that sentiment is born more from the positive impact those characters have than being underwhelmed by their involvement. In fact, the stories associated with these characters are sometimes so strong that there's a good chance they will elicit raw emotional sentiments, allowing the narrative of Final Fantasy XVI to transcend to a whole new level. When the game concludes after a very intense and epic showdown, these moments, which serve to form deep emotional connections with the characters, are a massive contributor towards making the story feel complete. There's a clear message, and it's delivered as the creators intended. And throughout, there are just so many emotional and impactful scenes that have weight, brevity, and meaning. This then extends through to the ending sequence, which it's pleasing to say was very satisfying and serves as a fitting conclusion to what can only be described as a fantastic story, both from the sense of its critical path, but also everything else the wider narrative grows to encompass. And don't be surprised if it's hard to keep emotions in check when those credits roll. Outside of the writing and clear narrative direction, one of the primary reasons for why the story of Final Fantasy XVI lands so well is the performances. Considerable time and effort was spent on ensuring this aspect of the game exceeded expectations, and having now experienced the entire narrative in full, it's safe to say that expectations have indeed been exceeded. You can tell how much love and care was placed around ensuring every single line of dialogue landed in the way it was intended, and credit needs to be given here to everyone involved. This of course relates to Kazutoyo Maehiro, who wrote the scenario and served as the game's creative director, and the extended team of scenario writers who supported. But credit also needs to be given to Michael Christopher Kojifox and his team, who painstakingly took the Japanese source material and didn't just adjust it for English speakers, but rewrote it to suit them. This process enabled actors like Ben Starr, who plays Clive, and Susanna Fielding, who plays Jill, to have a lot more freedom in their performances, and the results speak for themselves. By not having to compromise or try to match what was done in another language, the actors were free to express themselves. It has led to performances that are raw and filled with emotion. You can tell the actors poured their heart and souls into every single line, and it's no surprise to learn that the recording process took over 4 years as a result. As you play through Final Fantasy XVI and experience everything that Valisthea has to offer, you'll find a world that is so full of colourful personalities, brought to life by stellar voice work. And that this applies to not just the core group, but also every single member of the wider ensemble cast is a testament to how diligent the team were in ensuring this aspect of presentation landed. This has only been made possible due to an unorthodox approach that was decided upon early on in development, English first. And it's this approach that empowered other elements, such as the inclusion of different accents from across the British Isles, complete with local slang. Voice is also something that ended up creeping into every facet of Final Fantasy XVI. As you walk around the various locations, there's so much dialogue to take in. Random NPCs that you can't even interact with all have something to say, and what's quite novel is that they each have names and professions. In theory, this could have become quite grating, but due to how much effort was placed on ensuring the world is contextual to whatever's happening, the dialogue always feels relevant. And that notion has been taken to such extreme levels that NPC dialogue will even update to reflect side quests being completed. The only slight negative throughout all of this is that there's the occasional lip flap, but given the sheer volume of lines of dialogue featured in this game, it's something that is excusable. This level of care and attention then extends through to other aspects of presentation. Cinematography helps to elevate the many cutscenes that feature throughout, and sound design is nothing short of exquisite. No matter what's happening in a particular scene, it's enriched by the sound effects that are sensitive to whatever visual stimulus is being presented. One of the earliest examples of this can be found in the aftermath of the epic clash between Titan and Shiva. As you traverse through the ravaged battlefield, should you happen to walk near shards of ice, you'll hear the splintering as it cracks and melts due to the searing heat of the desert. This attention to detail then follows through to the visuals. Final Fantasy XVI features an incredible level of graphical fidelity, especially when it comes to the environments and clothing. Phoenix Gate, for example, is an incredible structure, as is the Imperial Garrison of Caer Norvent. If you just take a moment to stop and look around at the actual construction of these castles, it's pretty incredible the amount of detail that's been packed in. The same also applies to the individual characters. You can see the fibres on Elwyn Rossfield's cloth jerkin, and the textures of Clyde's various outfits are very pronounced. Beyond this, Final Fantasy XVI features some incredible vistas and unique settings. And there's been a fantastic level of detail placed on visual storytelling. Valisthea will update its visual aesthetic as the story progresses. Caer Norvent, for example, will forever be scarred by the fight against Benedicta. And when larger world-affecting events happen, the entire populace react as you would expect. The field is also quite large. Final Fantasy XVI is far from being an open-world game, but there are specific hubs that build out and offer a lot of freedom for exploration. There are plenty of nooks and crannies, and you'll need to search far and wide for some of the more elusive hunts. Now, based on how much attention has been placed on these individual aspects of presentation, it should come as no surprise that the soundtrack delivers on multiple levels. And huge praise needs to be offered here to Masayoshi Soken and the extensive team of composers and arrangers who helped to produce the Final Fantasy XVI original soundtrack. Some of the pieces of boss and battle music that feature throughout are nothing short of sublime, and the mid-boss fight music transitions are fantastic. What's even more impressive about the soundtrack in general is that even though individual tracks are special in their own right, there's so much audio storytelling taking place. Each character has a clear theme, and once you've gained an appreciation for that theme, you'll start to hear it woven throughout the rest of the soundtrack. Perhaps one of the best examples happens during the game's opening moments. As Shiva rises up to square off against Titan, Jill's theme is front and center, and as the conflict evolves, Hugo's theme is interspersed. When this happens, the player would know so little about these characters that the importance of these themes will be lost, but that they are introduced here in such bold and brazen manner is powerful, and when Clive and Jill later talk on the balcony, her leitmotif can be heard. This goes back to how much attention to detail there is throughout Final Fantasy XVI. Everything you see and hear in this game, from the narrative through to the gameplay and the numerous presentation aspects, has a clear, defined purpose. Clues are littered everywhere, and it's down to the player to only open their eyes and see them. That then brings us onto how much time you'll spend in Valisthea and how much time you'll want to spend in Valisthea. Having played on action-focused difficulty with no rings of accessibility, the game posed a suitable challenge. But by doing all of the side quests and ancillary tasks and getting the best gear available, there was also a degree of being over-leveled and overpowered by that simple virtue. Should players choose to have a primary focus on the main story and skip all of the optional narrative and gameplay challenges, then it stands to reason that some of the mandatory encounters will be much more challenging. Throughout, there is a significant volume of side quests, and they will soak up a good chunk of time, but at no point did they feel like filler. Side quests were instead used to enrich the story, and any experience, ability points, skill, and crafting materials gained were an added bonus. The same can also be said for the hunts. These are not available right at the start of the game, but after progressing through a certain portion, hunts will become available. These can provide a real challenge, especially those given the coveted S rank, and they provide a nice way for players to test themselves, with again, the spoils being a good reward. Most of the spoils from these activities can then be used for crafting, and this is one aspect that feels a bit undercooked. Throughout, you can either purchase basic weapons and defensive gear or craft them, and some of these pieces of equipment can then be reinforced by 2 levels, but the whole system feels quite rudimentary. There's no way to customize the equipment, nor is the player given too many options. At each stage, this boils down to there being an optimal piece of equipment for each slot. As such, the weapon equipped does little to affect playstyles, only increasing in physical and will damage, and defensive equipment is much the same, limited in options and only increasing defense and HP. The notion of there being a crafting system suggested a bit more depth, but that depth unfortunately doesn't materialize. Accessories, however, provide a lot more variety, and these can be used to great effect to adjust and enhance particular playstyles. The acquisition of these accessories is tied to side quests and hunts, but they can also be found in the field when exploring different locations. Some, however, can only be acquired through the renown system. By completing mandatory and optional tasks, Clive will gain renown, and as this increases, people from across Valisthea will offer donations in the form of useful items, music that can be played in the jukebox, and rare accessories. Now, further to these baked-in activities, Final Fantasy XVI offers plenty of challenges that are sure to keep gameplay enthusiasts engaged for some time. Through the Eretta Stone, it's possible to replay stages so that items that were perhaps missed can be acquired, and to engage with Arcade Mode. Arcade Mode provides a cut-down version of specific linear passages of play where much of the narrative has been removed. This means everything is focused on the gameplay instances. These instances are scored based on how well and stylishly the player vanquishes the foes that are placed before them, and a final grade is offered up at the end. During a regular playthrough, Arcade Mode will correspond with what was encountered, serving as an exact replica of that initial instance. But after finishing the game, Arcade Mode gets upgraded to reflect the unlocking of 2 new difficulty options, Final Fantasy and Ultimaniac. This then relates to 2 wider changes, as upon completing Final Fantasy XVI, it's possible to start New Game Plus and use Final Fantasy difficulty, where everything is carried over and the level cap is increased. The typical expectation for this kind of enhanced difficulty setting is that enemies will simply have their levels increased, bumping up their stats to increase the challenge. And while that does still happen, Final Fantasy difficulty ups the ante further by having enemies be much more offensive. They will now spend less time waiting to perform subsequent actions, and when squaring off against multiple enemies, the propensity for them to attack as a group, as opposed to waiting for their turn, is much higher. The other challenge comes from a complete change in enemy formations. Larger foes that feature will gauges will be inserted into regular encounters, and this can catch even hardened players by surprise. During a playthrough on Final Fantasy difficulty, Arcade Mode then becomes upgraded, and it's here that Ultimaniac difficulty becomes available. Pushing the aforementioned notions even further, Ultimaniac difficulty provides some of the purest gameplay challenges Final Fantasy XVI has to offer, and as such, both the Final Fantasy and Ultimaniac difficulty iterations of Arcade Mode will feature worldwide leaderboards. The other challenge will come from what's known as chronoliths. Scattered throughout Valisthea, the chronolith are relics of a bygone era. There is one for each icon, and when engaged, they contain challenges that restrict Clive to only being able to use certain iconic abilities in isolation. To enhance these challenges, there are strict time limits, with extensions being offered for using abilities in certain ways. As such, the chronoliths will help players to become much more comfortable with each iconic set. After completing the initial trial, final chronolith challenges are then unlocked, and due to the ramp up in difficulty, they too feature worldwide leaderboards. When layered over the main story, it means there are plenty of activities to keep players occupied for many, many hours. And this relates to the more story-focused activities, through to the inclusion of so many narrative-rich side quests, and then gameplay-focused activities such as hunts, arcade mode, and the chronoliths. Having experienced almost everything Final Fantasy XVI has to offer, it feels like a real landmark for the Final Fantasy franchise. At its core is a rich and compelling narrative that is brought to life by fantastic performances. It builds over time in such an incredible fashion, and central to this is Clive Rossfield. Everything funnels through him, but instead of being drowned out, the supporting cast feed off of this energy. They each become compelling characters in their own right, as does the wider world of Valisthea. When also considering the top-notch gameplay, stunning presentation, and copious amounts of compelling side quests and gameplay challenges, it's hard not to consider Final Fantasy XVI as a must-have game for anyone who owns a PlayStation 5. And from a Final Fantasy perspective, Final Fantasy XVI stands as a very strong contender to those games released during the so-called golden era of the franchise. Thank you for watching all the way through to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this extensive video review. If you did, then liking the video and sharing it around would be much appreciated. If you aren't already, please also consider subscribing to Final Fantasy Union. This review is but a taste of the content we produce, and over the next few weeks, we plan to pump out a ton of Final Fantasy XVI related content that we hope will enrich your playing and watching experience. Alright, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galson D. Kujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.